before we get into this, I will say it's kind of a mess. My thoughts are a little all over the place because they're sort of on the book situation, so I apologize if it's a little scatterbrained. It's because I am. So, sorry in advance. Hello! If you are coming from my Camp Nano videos or have seen the thumbnails for them, you might be like, hey, you're in the same outfit. And that's because I'm in the same brain, as always, but in the same mindset, is what I mean to say. And so some of the stuff that I'm going to address here might be redundant to that video, but not everyone wants to watch the nano vlogs, and that's totally okay. But this video, we're going to be talking about how to start writing a book, which is something that I know lots of people struggle with, because you have these ideas, and you want to get them on paper, but you're like, how in the heck do I start actually writing a book? I haven't finished my books yet, so I don't know if this is going to come across as condescending in some way. I've started many books, and I've failed many times in getting far, and I think I have a pretty good sense of what works and what doesn't, at least for me, but I think that, you know, my failures and my potential successes might be able to give some insight to what's helpful and what might be not so helpful when you're trying to write a book, because it's very intimidating. And I think, you know, if you're here and you're actually trying to write a book, that's awesome. You know, I think we need to encourage more people because it's overwhelming and crazy and the market's flooded and you might get discouraged, but I don't think you should. I think if there's a story that you want to tell, absolutely you should write it. And maybe it doesn't get published, maybe it does, but I don't think that should be your main goal if this is your first book. I think you should just try to get it done, because I think that's the biggest difficulty, is finishing a book. And whether or not it's successful, you know, in the grand scheme of success, you know, publishing, etc. I mean, it matters, but it doesn't matter as much as knowing that you can, because if that one isn't the one that, you know, goes to market, maybe another one will be, but at least you know that you're capable of finishing a book. So I started writing a new book for Camp Nano this month of April. I have the other one that I'm almost done from November. Wow, the months all blend together. But we're taking a break from that so that I can do this, and we can talk about how to start it, because it's a very different process from being in the middle after researching a lot of other things. And this one's been a doozy. I thought it was going to be worse doing the fantasy book because I had to come up with my whole world, and to some degree it was, but also you have no confines within, like, reality for that one. You can make stuff up and how everything works. This one is happening in our world, which means I have to abide by our rules, which is good in some ways and difficult in a lot of others, because things have to be more realistic, you know, and you think you know what that means because you've lived in this world for however long you've been alive, and then you go to write it and you realize you really don't know much of anything. At least I did. So March has been a lot of research, which is the first thing that I'm going to bring up, even though it's not necessarily the first thing that happens. No matter what genre you're writing, you need to do some research. So let's rewind for just a half second, talk about genre. It doesn't really matter. I mean, this kind of applies to everything, probably more so to fiction books, but it still works if it's nonfiction. Know your genre. That's probably the first big thing. What kind of book are you writing? There's so many different options. And they don't always have to be like hard and fast one thing. Like, you can have a suspense thriller or whatever, or a fantasy thriller, but, you know, they don't have to fit exactly into one box, but you kind of have to have a good sense of where it's going. Then you've got to figure out what's your general story idea. And if you're here, you've probably got something in mind, but if you're just like, I want to write a book, I don't really know what about, but I know I want to write one, then, you know, you can have inspiration from lots of places, from your real life, from media, from some other, like, book, TV show, if you want to take just a little bit of inspiration from, you know, something, but not too close, because you don't want to write the same thing. That gets kind of messy. But if you have an idea that sparks from it, that's totally fine. Maybe you've got one scene in your head that you cannot get out, which is what's been happening a bit to me. I've had little bits and pieces of story ideas from different things that have all kind of come into one story, which is really exciting because it means that I get to write something that I've been wanting to write in scatterbrained pieces, honestly, for the last year or so. But, you know, maybe you have one scene or a bit of dialogue or just a world that you dreamed up that you really, really want to write. And you're excited about it, and I think that the first thing is holding on to that inspiration. because it's going to be a long, grueling process, especially if it's your first book, and you're going to want to quit. So you've got to find the thing that makes it exciting for you. The thing that makes you want to sit down and write for however many hours a day, week, whatever, in the free time that you have, which I know in this world everybody's so busy, but the thing that made you excited about this book, that's the thing that you're going to want to put on post-it notes or put on a poster or just write on your hand and be like, this is why I'm excited about it, this is why I'm doing it, and then you write it. Because otherwise you're going to sit there and be like, I hate this, I hate my existence, and I'm going to quit. And, you know, if you really, really hate the process and you hate it and it's not for you, that's one thing. But I think if you're here and you want to write it, then you got to hold on to it, right? So my first steps sort of start very jumbled. Like I said, I have ideas coming from all over the place, so I need to write them down, even if it's messy. Handwriting it, typing it up, speaking into a recorder. I know people who do all different kinds of things, and they're all valid. It just depends on the way you think. You know, if you think best in the shower, maybe you should take a little recorder you can hang outside or something and talk out loud, or pace and hold a thing. It just depends. It depends on how you operate. There's no wrong way to come up with ideas, but you gotta write them down eventually is the thing. My methods, because I had ideas already, I had to write down the dialogue bits that I sort of had in mind, or the character traits that I had in mind, the things that have already come to the table, so that I can start to plan around it. So I think that the first thing is write down what you have, go from there. Because at the same time, when you're writing that down, it not only helps you see what you have already, but it might help plan and brainstorm further, which is another thing that can happen when you do your research. So like I said, this book has taken weeks and weeks of research. I took several online classes, 2-part class in negotiation, the master class ones. That was very interesting. I took the lecture as well, where you had to write out the answers. I feel ready to negotiate with anybody now. I'm prepared. I also took some criminal psychology classes and regular psychology classes and developmental psychology, how trauma as a child affects you as an adult sorts of classes, development of cities classes. That was one of the online ones through the Harvard lectures. And gosh, my brain's tired. Then I was watching some TED Talks about organized crime and the development of crime. And I mean, I have a criminal justice degree, and so a lot of it was I had the background information on that at least. And the criminal psychology, I had some from college, but my brain is tired. I'm so tired. But it's been really interesting, and I think it's going to help a lot with the character development. So I've, some of the stuff that I've been listening to, watching, reading, whatever, I have notes just on that, and some of it I would have to pause in the middle of a lecture, and I'm like, this is exactly the kind of thing that I need for the character, or whatever. But then you have things like how childhood trauma affects the body, specifically, and then also PTSD, because there's different ways that, at certain ages, and your body's still developing, that it changes how you think and how you operate. And so that affects how the characters that have gone through all this trauma in the book that I'm working on are going to end up expressing that later on in life. So that was part of my character development research. It's a lot. It's good though, and I think it's not just good for this book, but for other projects going forward, so it doesn't seem like a waste of time. And I said this in my Camp Nano video 1, but it actually helped me, realize a lot of stuff that could happen in the book beyond just character development. I was listening to certain things, and it gave me sparks of an idea for different plot points that I was trying to figure out before, so I think it can definitely be beneficial in a lot of ways to do research. And any genre, you're gonna have to do it. Even if it's fantasy and you're like, hey, but I am making up my whole world. Okay, well, it might be a different kind of research, but you're gonna have to think about how do the dynamics work in your world? Is everybody exactly the same, or are there power dynamics, race dynamics, class dynamics, education, just social issues in general? I don't know how they're gonna play out in your fantasy world. Is there trade? So you might have to end up doing some research, even beyond just plotting out ideas, just research on how societies work, depending on, if this is a kind of fantasy world that's a town. You're gonna have to do it. In all of this, you need to be thinking about what kind of writer you are. So I'm a plantser. I half plan, half write off the cuff, if you will, though I have no cuffs. I write off the snake ring. But I still kind of have a general sense of where things are going. So like I think I said, I have my ending written out, so I write towards that. I know where I'm going with my characters. This one's multi-POV, so everything sort of interweaves through different character perspectives, and the story is pushed along that way because they're all interacting in a similar area. So it's how they're seeing the situation, but it's progressing pretty quickly. It's a pretty fast-paced one. So you gotta think about how you write best. If it's gonna be spending extra time before you start writing, doing your outline, that's good. If you're like me and you just sort of plan a little and then write a lot, then you're gonna have to know how much you need to have pre-planned. Or if you need to just have plot points figured out, or if you're just gonna write random scenes and then put them in an order and then fill them in between, however you write best, that's okay. And no matter what style of writer you are, you're gonna end up going back. So writing isn't a checklist. It's gonna be a lot of back and forth and back and forth. You're not just gonna research once, check off, and then write a little bit, check off chapter 1, and then, you know, I've done my research, and then I've done my planning, and I've done my editing, and blah, blah, blah. Like, it's not checking off things along the way. You're just gonna keep bouncing back and forth, and that's okay. I think that we get too hung up on, like, oh, I'm finished the draft, and so now I'm editing, and I'm editing in a way that I'm just fixing little details, and I'm not willing to make grand changes. And that kind of thought process tends to affect us from the very, very beginning. So we need to think, like, what's going to be the best thing for this story? If it's not having this idea, even though I love it so much, then it's not gonna work, right? So even if you're planning your outline and you're writing it, and you've done all your research for this one scene and you've spent tons of time preparing for it, you gotta let it go if it's not gonna work. And I think that's one of the key points of what not to do when you start writing a book, is to harp so much on the things that you think you need that you don't see the bigger picture. So if you're writing, even if it's the scene that inspired the book, I've had that before. I mean, it was with fan fiction, but still. So it wasn't like, the stakes weren't quite as high. But where I had this one idea that was like the inspiration for the story, and then when I was writing the story, it didn't fit with the characterization that I had at that point, and I had to go, and it was so upsetting, because I'm like, this is the reason I'm here. But you just, sometimes you gotta kill your darlings, as they say, and that's okay. And sometimes letting go is really hard, but we gotta let it go, right? Some people say book writing is like a puzzle, right? So you've got your border, which is kind of your world building situation, and then all the pieces in the middle are characters and arcs and everything that fits together. And maybe that's kind of true, but I think if anything, it's more like makeup or sewing. I've been doing a lot of sewing lately, so I'm thinking about that, making a garment. You know, there's all these little pieces that you have to sew together to make a bear. And sometimes the bear doesn't work out very well. He's okay. I sewed his head on sideways. He was prototype number 2. The first one's even worse. But I've gotten better. And that's the thing is, you know, things aren't going to be perfect right away. Sometimes you end up with some really sad looking bears. But you've got to look at each individual component, figure out what works, what doesn't, and how they fit together. And so if you want it to be a puzzle, at the very least it should be a Rubik's Cube. So you're going to move everything around, and eventually it's going to have to work together on all sides. You know, side 1 is your world building, side 2 are your characters, side 3 is your dialogue in general, and then your arcs, and everything's got to move around just right so that when it all comes together it makes sense. Because it's going to look like a mess to you, I think, no matter how good and how tight you get the story, because you know everything that went on behind the scenes, but a reader is not going to see that. So don't get too intimidated. Don't think that you're bad just because your first attempts at writing or your first attempts at drafting and planning aren't going well. Just get your words down on the page, get your thoughts down on the page, and keep going. Because if you're dedicated enough to do this, then you can be a writer. Anybody can be a writer, so long as you write. And that doesn't mean you're going to be published necessarily, but that's not a bad thing. You should be writing because you love it, especially if this is your first story. You gotta write it because this is something that you want to get out into the world. And if it goes beyond that, then that's wonderful. But hold on to your motivation. Don't let it go. Keep on trying. And worst comes to worst, find a group of people online, on Discord, on YouTube, on anything that understands your problems, that can see and help you along on your path, because there are so many of us out there, so many people who love writing and would love to hear your story. So just don't give up. Now here's a few things that you probably shouldn't do if you're trying to write a book. Again, these are all kind of subjective, so like don't be too intimidated or upset if this is something that like helps you write. It just doesn't help everyone. So we're gonna look big picture. Okay, first step, don't let yourself get too overwhelmed. I know that's a broad statement, seems obvious, but this is a very overwhelming process. And sometimes you can feel very emotional about things. It's okay. Sometimes you gotta take a step back, and that's also okay. I think you gotta take care of yourself first. This is your first book, it's not for work. You're not trying to, meet your deadlines for an editor or something. You can plot out your timeline when you want to have things done, but don't let it kill you, right? This is supposed to be fun, to get your story out. Just breathe, yeah? Don't get too overwhelmed. 2, don't harp too much on the little details at first, or how good or bad the writing is, because that's all going to change later on. This is like, think about when you're in elementary school, or whatever version your country may have, and they teach you history, right? They'll teach you kind of the broad strokes, happy version of history, and then later down the line, you start to learn all the little details that make you think, maybe things aren't quite as simple as I was taught when I was a child. So you wanna start writing from kindergarten level, right? You don't wanna get too focused on making the writing perfect and the details right there, because you're gonna come across something down the line when you're writing, whether it's some sort of plot hole you have to fill, or something you didn't account for, or an idea that's just so amazing that you can't not put it into the book and it changes everything, and then all that time that you spent writing, it's going to be down the drain. So get your ideas down. Don't worry too much about it sounding beautiful. And if you can help it, don't go back and edit every single chapter as you're going. You will never, ever accomplish anything. I've done that so many times before, because it just has to sound perfect, and it has to be amazing, and otherwise I'm a bad writer, and that's not true. That's not true. You're just trying to get stuff on the page. It's like putting on your makeup, right? I mean, not everyone does that, but if you're a person who wears makeup, it doesn't always look good when you first start doing it. It's like splashy, and you got stuff that you gotta clean up, and I haven't even fully finished this. So it's like one thing at a time, right? You can't expect it to be a masterpiece at first. You just gotta make the broad strokes. I'm trying to keep it pretty simple in this video. There's plenty of things that make it more challenging, we'll say, to do when you start writing a book for the first time, but I don't want to get too in-depth on those, because then that kind of just gets kind of sad, and we can jump into some more of those later if you guys have any interest in that. So we're gonna just leave it with one last thing best not to do when you're writing, and that is not write. I know that seems, again, very obvious, but sometimes you get so interested in the outlining process, or the researching process, or the world building process, that you don't actually write the book. You gotta write it. It doesn't really matter how complex your world building is. If you don't have anything on the page, and I'm not the first person to say this, then you haven't written a book. You've thought about it a lot, and that's awesome. Not a bad thing to think about it. But it's not a book. So just let yourself, write down the things that you think are necessary, world building wise, character wise, etc. And then start writing. And if you're really having a hard time getting started, then what I usually do is, I will say, even though this contradicts a little bit what I said before, I'll write out a really good first chapter, or a really good end chapter if I know where that's going to be. And that one I will edit to hell. And I'll make it sound really amazing, and just the first chapter. Because that way, every time I think, wow, I'm a bad writer, I can't do this, and I get distracted and focused on other things, I can go back to that one piece and be like, okay, I'm capable of writing, I'm just in it right now. I'm drowning a little bit, but there's a life raft over there, I can see things are here to grab, I'm not actually drowning. you know, then you can stand up and realize you're only in like a foot of water. So just breathe and write, and then you're on your way. So this is sort of a broad strokes, kind of like beginning to write a book process style video where we're just looking at a little bit of everything, just to get you motivated to start. So that's what I'm gonna do, kind of where we're gonna leave off. You can do it. It's like the beginning of a new month. I don't care if it's April Fool's Day because I'm not acknowledging it except for right now when we've acknowledged it. It's the first day right now. So let's just write. It's a good day to start right now. You got it. And let me know down in the comments if you have any questions, if there's anything that, you know, you have been having problems with that you want to know about, or if there's another writing video that you're interested in, because that's going to be most of this month. And probably beyond that if anyone's interested. Got lots of other kinds of videos. Just did the Hannah Montana and how she affected the world kind of video, part 1. But if people really like writing videos, I can focus more on these. So let me know and, you know, appease the gods of YouTube with the liking and the subscribing, etc. Hit the bell if you want more. And if you want to see any of the videos I'm going to be posting for Nano this month for Camp Nano, I'll be around. So let me know. All right. Thanks for being here, guys. Sweet dreams.